everyone, welcome to episode 46 of the Startup Playbook podcast. My name is Rohit Bhargava, and each week I interview successful founders, investors, and subject matter experts on how they got started, the strategies they use to succeed, and their advice to current and future entrepreneurs. Before we get into this episode, if you missed episode 10 of Startup Playbook TV, I sat down with Oliver Garside, the co-founder and COO of Rounded, which provides accounting software for freelancers. In the episode, we talk about growth tactics for his product, building a community for Rounded, and using data to create a content marketing strategy. You can find all of the episodes by searching for Startup Playbook TV in YouTube or following the link in the show notes for this episode at startupplaybook.co. Coming back to this podcast episode, I speak to someone very familiar with building communities and creating content. My guest today is Simon Julian. Simon is currently the General Manager and Head of Monetisation at Sitepoint, one of the world's largest online communities for web developers. Prior to Sitepoint, Simon was Head of B2B Partnerships at Lonely Planet and spent several years in the agency space as Managing Partner of Areeba and GM of Reactive. In the interview, we cover a wide range of topics, including how to develop effective partnerships with large organizations, how to create an internal structure for growth, testing for cultural fit in new hires, and content creation and distribution strategies. Without further ado, here is my interview with Simon Julian. Hi Simon, welcome to the Startup Playbook podcast, and thanks so much for taking the time to be here today.
Hey Rohit, thanks very much. Good to be here.
So for those people that may not be as familiar with you or your background, can you share a little bit of your story and what got you here today?
Yeah, absolutely. Fair to say I've had a fairly varied background sort of gone from agencies, digital agencies, advertising agencies, that sort of thing, back and forth to product companies. Worked for Lonely Planet in partnerships for 5 years, and now to Sitepoint, working in a digital publisher. I think I've always been someone that's kind of like that, doing something different and trying out different things. So that's kind of allowed me to test out a bunch of different businesses and kind of growing different businesses, which has always been the thing I've enjoyed most.
Yeah, fantastic. So I guess you mentioned Lonely Planet was kind of your first large sort of foray into the publishing space.
Yep, indeed.
I guess if you could call it that. But I guess so. One of the things that you sort of mentioned that you did at Lonely Planet was looking after the B2B partnerships that were over
absolutely.
there. One of the things that I see a lot of sort of startups struggling with is, a lot of them want to develop partnerships with larger organizations or with other sort of organizations that there's sort of a value prop on both sides, but they find it very difficult to develop those partnerships in the first place. I was wondering if you could share any sort of advice on, what a good sort of partnership looks like, and secondly, what a process is for an early stage startup that's looking to partner up with potentially a larger organization than their own. What would you recommend they do?
Absolutely. So it's fair to say, I think that partnerships in general, a good partnership in the way that you were talking about, I think, is where both sides are getting sort of equal value. That's a really good partnership. It can be very difficult, particularly if you're early stage, to kind of get yourself to that position. And I think in a lot of cases, the sort of the weight that both sides places on a partnership would be very different, particularly if you're early stage. And I think in a lot of cases, partnerships can fall down because of the fact that the early stage startup might not be ready to kind of give away a little bit of extra value or something like that to kind of make the larger organisation sort of interested in doing the partnership in the first place. I think sticking to your guns too much in that kind of situation can be a difficulty. It was easy, if you're Lonely Planet doing a partnership with, say, Europe or something like that, you can do that because of the fact that you're working on the same kind of playing field. Early stage is kind of a different place to be with that. I think the other piece for me is it's really important in a partnership or in a something you're trying to put together as a partnership to kind of really understand the value that the other organisation places on you. And in an early stage kind of environment, I think you're generally really passionate about what you're doing, you love what you're doing, you're really interested in your stuff, but it's very hard to kind of look at what you're doing from someone else's perspective as far as value. And I think going into a kind of partnership, trying to kind of sell yourself in that way can make it a really difficult thing for both parties to kind of get value. And then things fall over pretty fast when you can only really talk about kind of what you're doing for yourself, which I think ruins things pretty fast.
Yeah, that's one of the biggest things that I kind of see people fall over is, they'll approach someone and say, I think it would be really great for us to partner with you so we can get access to your user base or to your community without really kind of offering any sort of incentive on the other side. In terms of, especially when you're sort of looking out to some of the larger organizations, again, one of the sort of components of partnerships is making sure that you talk to the right people or getting it into a company. Again, do you have sort of any advice or anything that you've learned from your experience in finding who the right person is to talk to, where somewhere where there might not be a partnership manager per se?
Absolutely. I think it's really interesting with that kind of thing how you can find really good people to talk to if you're happy to talk to anyone in an organisation. And I think you're right. In a lot of cases, sort of particularly organisations that don't necessarily have a sort of an obvious sort of partnerships manager, it can be hard to kind of navigate the territory. Finding a way in and talking to anyone in the organisation is a pretty good start. It gives you the ability to kind of ask the right questions around, if in this kind of situation, who would I talk to? Who does this kind of thing in your company? That sort of thing. I use tools like Hunter and Prospect and that kind of stuff on LinkedIn. I think a direct email is a lot better than a LinkedIn request and that sort of stuff. So normally I'll be emailing 3 or 4 people and then seeing who I can kind of get in front of. And that might not always be the right person, but if you're kind of respectful and you're kind of asking the right questions and not kind of taking up too much of people's time, normally they're happy to kind of help you out a little bit and sort of point you in the right direction.
Like on that, apart from Hunter, are there any other tools that you use to kind of manage those relationships as well?
I think from the perspective of anything we do, we're always using. We're pretty focused on organisations, so Trello is pretty big for us. We use Trello to kind of manage everything. If it's not in Trello, we aren't doing it. There's that. I think I'm really big on free apps, Gmail, any of the Google apps, all that sort of stuff is pretty good. Collaboration is really big in partnerships, so the sooner you get into a shared doc and you're actually working on something together, the more likely you are to have a partnership, I feel. So if you're actually actively engaging with someone in that way and you can actually get them onto a kind of collaborative tool, you're doing pretty well. Most of the time, so once someone's started to actually create some content and kind of do some kind of back and forth with you, then they start getting pretty engaged, I think.
Sure. And so I guess kind of moving forward a little bit in terms of your career, you then kind of stepped into agency world. Can you talk a little bit about sort of some of the things that you were doing within the agency environment and what were maybe some of the things you learnt from that experience?
So I'll speak to two agencies in particular. So when I left Lonely Planet, I started working for an agency called Areeba, and they were really interesting because they were very content management focused and very large corporate and government focused, and that was probably a good place to move to from Lonely Planet because it was very heavily partnerships focused. So we had a partnership with Vignette, we had a partnership with OpenText, who are two sort of large players in that environment, and got to the point where we were actually doing all of OpenText's work globally for them. And I went out to Canada a couple of times to some god-awful backwater where their office was that I can't even remember. Really nice kind of building these kind of really, really good sort of digital solutions to kind of government problems and these kind of things. And then left there to go and work at Reactive, which at that stage I think was about 25 people, and worked with them for 5 years, and the agency grew to the point where I think when I left there were about sort of 150 and 5 global offices. And they got sold to Accenture not very long ago. Reactive was a very different thing because it was very front-end focused, very user experience focused. We started to do a lot of work with smaller startups or creative organisations or kind of car companies and all these kind of things, but it was always very focused on that kind of really nice user experience, which has always been another sort of passionate area of mine, so that was good fun. Again, I think the agency stuff was really interesting from the point of view of understanding what clients wanted, understanding what their problems were, understanding what their audience's problems were, and then helping them to kind of solve those problems and kind of growing the agency as we went. And we were part of pardon me, part of SODA, the Society of Digital Agencies. So we had quite a lot of really interesting kind of collaboration with other agencies around the world, and sort of talking around structuring agencies and, you know, how to build the best sort of capabilities and build out sort of interesting areas of expertise. So that was good fun too.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess it's more of a personal question, since I've been sort of running an agency in stealth mode for the last few months. But when you sort of talk about a structure of, you know, whether you're running a startup or a business or an agency, what were some of the things that you sort of picked up from your time at Areeba and Reactive in terms of putting those structures in place to kind of help you grow?
I think probably the biggest thing that we did when we were structuring up Reactive, we looked at all the different accountabilities that people had in the organisation, and actually restructured the whole agency to have very clear accountabilities across the teams, and really clear kind of hierarchies in people as far as kind of who did what and what they were responsible for and that kind of thing. And that was really useful from the point of view of it gave people, they knew the person they needed to talk to about a particular problem, and they knew who was accountable for solving problems or issues or whatever it was. Clients knew how to kind of engage with us then, so there weren't multiple people that they were trying to talk to. And on the other side of things, the agency knew internally who was supposed to be doing what. And we actually structured up, we had a particular team structure in place at Reactive that we grew over time. So when I left, there were 5 teams of people, and each of those teams was particularly focused on a set of clients or relationships. And the teams had their own leaders and to a certain extent even their own sort of P&L, if you want to think of it that way, as far as they knew what they were making and what they were spending. So they were all kind of structured up as almost mini companies. And that helped us grow. And over time, as we kind of added more clients or more kind of capabilities, those teams helped us to kind of not only keep the culture in place, which I think is, you know, really important in an agency environment, but also to kind of keep the flow of knowledge and all of the kind of internal IP in place as well. So whenever you had new people kind of coming into the agency, they were working with people that had been there for a while and understood the systems and understand the structure and everything like that.
Absolutely. I mean, a really big sort of part of growth, you know, there's obviously the part of sort of getting more users or clients or whatever it is, but the other aspect of that is getting the right people on board and sort of, you know, kind of growing the human capital sort of side of it. What were, you know, obviously kind of looking at your experience, that's one of the things on LinkedIn that really sort of stood out to me was one of the things that you kind of mentioned over and over again was sort of putting together a really sort of high functioning team, you know, in multiple different roles. Again, can you kind of share a little bit of your sort of experience in how do you find the right sort of people and how do you sort of build that sort of team around you, and what does that sort of component and structure and things like that look like?
So from the point of view of hiring, if I talk about that, you know, to start answering your question, I have a particular structure I like to use for hiring. Multiple meetings I think is good. Meeting other people in the team is always a really good idea, and kind of giving people the opportunity to kind of hire into their teams I think is really important. But I always do a culture interview first. And so the first thing I'll do when I'm meeting somebody is about understanding who they are, not only understanding their kind of past history and all that kind of, you know, normal stuff that you would ask, but like what they like to do outside of work, who they are as a person, what their passions are, all these sort of things. And I think that's really important because of the fact that I think culture makes up so much of what is a high functioning team. And by culture, I don't mean, you know, I think you've got all the, you know, the ability to collaborate and diversity of ideas and all these kind of things, and understanding what people do and how they think and what their passions are helps you to kind of build a really good idea of how they would fit into a team. And where you're going at it from the point of view of diversity of ideas and all these kind of things, getting that idea and having that kind of strong view of, you know, I think this person's really going to fit into the team in this way. They're going to potentially challenge these other people. They're going to come in with new ideas. This experience they've got in the past is going to be really interesting from the point of view of no one's got that. that kind of thing I think can be really important, just to give you that ability to kind of get the whole team kind of lifting up with each new hire, which is really what you want to do. Like a high functioning team is about that, adding new flavour every single time you hire someone, and it doesn't really matter what level they are. I think you could do that with an intern if you want to, if they've got the right kind of experience or passion or whatever. That can even add that kind of extra element, I think, to a team.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. This is my own personal view, but I've always felt that skills to a degree can always be learnt or acquired, but what you can't teach someone is to share the same values or have the same sort of commitment.
Absolutely. And passion can't be taught as well. People are really passionate about a particular thing. I think that's a huge opportunity for an organisation. Yeah. As you say, any skill can probably be taught over time.
Yeah. So on kind of speaking about sort of that cultural fit, do you have any recommendations on how to sort of test that through a process? I was speaking to Mike Ebenham from Seed, and so one of the things that they did when they're hiring for developers is instead of asking them to send through a resume, they'll have a questionnaire that they have to send through and answer a bunch of questions. And so, again, it was kind of looking at the flexibility of people and how they kind of approach the different questions that they ask. Are there any sort of particular tests that you have in place or things that you look for if you're sort of meeting with people one-on-one?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. So questionnaires are really good. We normally use, I've got sort of 2 or 3 questionnaires that I like to use for different roles as that way of sort of testing, getting a little bit of an idea of the kind of cultural element. Go all the way down to the kind of Myers-Briggs and all those kind of things, but I'm not quite that full on about it. We like to do things, if you talk about developers in particular, we like to do things like developer tests and these kind of things. And you've got a bunch of these different tests, like robot tests and these kind of things, where you can kind of, it's more about the way someone thinks than about the problem itself. And it gives you the idea of kind of how they would attack a certain problem or approach a problem, not really worried about what the actual solution was. So a lot of these tests, you can have 100 different solutions to the problem. It's actually the way they deal with it that's the thing you're looking for.
Sure. Yeah. And I guess kind of moving forward to what you're sort of doing at the moment. So you're GM and Head of Monetisation at Sitepoint.
Yep.
Again, I mean, Sitepoint has been one of sort of the pillars of the sort of Victorian startup ecosystem for a long time now. But for those people that may not be as familiar with Sitepoint and what it does, can you share a little bit of what Sitepoint is?
Absolutely. So Sitepoint has gone through a whole lot of iterations over time. As you say, I think Sitepoint's been around since 99 and pivoted a number of times. The latest version of Sitepoint is a really large sort of niche web developer community. So we generally sit around sort of 5.5 million unique users a month, something along the lines of sort of 21 million unique sessions a month. That sort of really big niche audience is sort of mainly front-end focused, but UI and UX experience, PHP, quite a lot of entrepreneurial audience in there, as far as a lot of these people are kind of building their own businesses or running freelance agencies, or in some cases they might be VPs of technology or growing their own startups and these kind of things. And the network is really focused on the idea of kind of solving problems. So if you're sitting at your desk and you've got a dev problem or a design problem, or you've got something you literally can't solve, that's kind of what Sitepoint does. So you're on Google and you're actually looking for the solution to an issue, and that you find your solution on Sitepoint. We work across sort of articles. We probably release something along the lines of sort of 40 to 60 articles a week. Quite a lot of things like screencasts, video courses. So we do sort of probably a couple of mini courses and a course a month, plus books and that sort of thing. So it's a pretty big kind of publishing engine. Team in Melbourne's pretty small. There's 15 of us in Melbourne here. But we've got a sort of distributed team of 14 editors around the world in places like Prague and Belgrade and places like that. And probably about 400 contributors that we use globally to create content.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, that's a lot of content to kind of publish weekly.
There's a lot of content.
I struggle to put out, the weekly sort of podcast and Startup Playbook TV episodes. But in terms of, I guess when you've got so much sort of content that's coming out weekly, do you have, a sort of a set structure or ways that you sort of look at new content that can engage with your audience?
Yeah. So because it's a distributed structure, we can sort of we do a lot of research. We understand each of the audiences pretty well. We understand what they're looking for. We're sort of trying to get better over time at that sort of 80-20 rule, where sort of 80% of our content's very focused on ROI to a certain extent, in that we know that it's content the audience wants, and also our advertisers or partners, all those kind of things, will be able to get value out of it. And then on the other 20%, it's new stuff, things that we haven't gone into before, stuff that we might not have kind of attacked, and we're just trying to kind of build new audiences or look at different things that we might do. The structure of all of that is really built around the idea of anything that's going to help someone grow as a web developer or an entrepreneur, or those kind of things, help them kind of get better at what they do, is kind of what we focus on.
Sure.
Yeah.
And I mean, so obviously, the content creation is one aspect of it. The next part is, how do you get people to see it? Obviously, with a really large community that's such a Sitepoint, that to a degree is relatively easy. But I guess, again, as sort of content producers, you want to get as many eyeballs and have growth on that sort of platform as much as possible. So are there any sort of tactics that you can share that kind of help you sort of distribute out content and grow even when you've got such a large base of people to work
Absolutely.
with?
And I mean, look, it's important to say, I think at various points we've patted ourselves on the back for having a really big audience, and then realised that we're actually just marketing to our really big audience. And you can fall into that trap pretty easily. So distribution, I think, is a really big part of what we try and do and get right. And there's always 100 different ways you can do that. Partnerships, again, are a really big thing. And we do a lot of joint partnerships around list building, content creation, campaigns and sort of competitions and these kind of things that we might be doing. So we've got I think something along the lines of probably 40 or 50 partners, content partners, that we would be sort of doing that kind of stuff with. And a lot of that's just kind of, email sharing or those kind of things that you might be doing to kind of grow. Getting to audiences that are outside of your kind of the people that know you, I think, is really important.
Yeah. Like, are there anything that you can kind of share strategy-wise that's worked for you apart from some partnerships?
Yeah, I think, socials work pretty well for us. Again, because we're very focused around the problem solution, in a lot of cases, if you can hit the right audience who are looking for, have a particular problem or are trying to do a certain thing as far as learning and that sort of thing, and kind of find that audience across whatever social channel they're kind of living in, and then kind of directly attack them. I think that makes really good sense. So we do a lot of social advertising and that sort of thing. That can be really cost effective because of the fact that in a lot of cases, particularly with things like Facebook advertising, you don't have to spend a lot of money to get to an audience. So a lot of that, we've played with Instagram a little bit. That was an abject failure because we worked out that our audience don't really go on Instagram. It's worth doing anyway. It's always worth trying things out. Twitter's really good for us. In a lot of cases, the sort of problem solution approach, again, works really well in 144 characters. So that's been an area for us that's been kind of really valuable, I think, is Twitter advertising and that sort of thing. Yeah.
That's that's kind of a big thing that I kind of talk to a lot of startups who are talking about sort of marketing or sort of growth strategies as well. Is everything sort of works. So Instagram works. It's just it's not the right sort of channel for Sitepoint, but it can be, if your audience sort of plays in that space. So it's really important to know who your audience is and who you're trying to reach.
Absolutely.
What has their attention.
And look, some of the stuff we did, I think it's always worth just trying things out. And for us, it was like, well, we literally don't know whether our audience play on Instagram. Let's have a go. Let's actually see whether they're there.
Yeah.
We worked out they weren't.
Again, sort of we've touched on this a couple of times, but, Sitepoint obviously has a really big community and they've had that since for a really long time now. So it's one thing to have a really big community. It's another thing to have a highly engaged community.
Yep.
Again, can you kind of share some of the ways that you can ensure that you are constantly engaging with the community and providing, highly valuable content or sort of different touch points to make sure that that the people that are involved are getting value from you?
Absolutely. So we always had a subscription platform. So we've always had what was Learnable, but we rebranded it as Sitepoint Premium a little while ago. That's always been a nice sort of nice way of kind of providing an extra platform for engagement for people. That's a paid platform. About 6 months ago, we opened a free account on that and started creating free content. That was mainly sort of strategized around the idea of engagement and around sort of giving people additional value to kind of help them and help them kind of engage with the platform. So we now create, out of all that content I was talking about before, the large amounts of content we create, there's quite a lot of that would actually be free. The articles have always been free because they're advertising and partnership funded, but a lot of the video content and even book content, that sort of thing, we now release as free content to people, really just to be able to actively engage with them around a piece of content that isn't going to be a kind of paid exercise. And that gives us that more of an opportunity to kind of grow with people and talk to them and kind of understand what they want and that sort of thing around the content itself. We do a lot with our list. We've got a very big email list. So there's a lot of newsletters. There's a lot of kind of external content engagement, those kind of things. We've played a lot with a lot of that sort of stuff as far as things that work. Our kind of highest performing newsletter is a newsletter called Versioning, which is our head of content actually writes it every day. It's a daily newsletter. It's relatively small. It's only got I think there's about 20,000 people on the list. But comparatively speaking, clicks and opens, you're probably up in the sort of 45-50% kind of range for it. Yeah. And it's because it's personalised. It's Adam writes the whole thing. It's really built around the idea of kind of finding interesting stuff on the web and getting it out there to people.
Yeah.
And we've found some of those kind of things have been really nice for us to do, just from the point of view of kind of you get this very nicely engaged kind of bunch of people that kind of they know Adam, they know how he thinks. He's a pretty funny guy, so that helps. So it's a pretty lighthearted kind of piece of content, but it works really nicely.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, I think an email list of 20,000. I think a lot of startups would love to have 45% open rate with that. But again, I guess one of the traps that I see a lot of startups fall into, especially when it comes to things like newsletters or content, is just having a newsletter for the sake of having a newsletter. Again, you sort of mentioned that you have a lot of different sort of channels and different newsletters that you have. Can you sort of talk about how some of those different ideas come about and how you sort of decide to go ahead with a particular sort of channel?
So it's interesting, and I'm happy to be fairly open around things like the newsletters, where we've tried a bunch of different methods for doing them, and we've tried things like digests and those sort of things, and you need to be doing all this testing and this sort of stuff. But I mean, we've found with our newsletters that when we were doing them in digest format, so that was just purely regurgitating content that had been created and put onto the website, that didn't work, and it didn't work for specific reasons, and it was because people were coming to Sitepoint looking for solutions to problems. So when the content was reformatted into a newsletter format, it wasn't actually that interesting, and people didn't really want to read it in that context. So we recontextualised the newsletters more into kind of interesting things around the web and more audience specific things, but not focused on that sort of same type of content as they would get on the website. So they were reimagined as a new product to a certain extent. And that helped a lot with engagement, and people got much more interested in kind of, getting those newsletters and stuff like that. We definitely don't do it for all of our channels. It's sort of some of the larger channels you kind of build these big newsletters around because of the fact that you've got a pretty engaged group of people who, when you put a new product in front of them, they're actively going to look at it and give you feedback and be interested and everything like that. And that's really what you want. Like, we want people to actually engage and tell us what they like, and then we can keep kind of optimising and iterating and kind of getting better at what we do.
Sure. So I guess it comes down to really understanding your community and what it is that they're coming to you and looking for. And
look, I think the big thing there is being open as well. And I think, to your point, where you are thinking about kind of creating a newsletter as a sort of fairly new startup, using it as an engagement channel for people to kind of tell you what they like is probably the most important thing to do in the early stages. Mainly because of the fact that whatever you kind of do as your sort of first iteration is probably going to be wrong. You probably need people to tell you that too. And so being able to then iterate and kind of understand what people want and kind of look to give them that is kind of really important.
Sure.
Yeah.
And so speaking to communities, I just wanted to touch on your new sort of project, coffee and finance and coffee. Can you share a little bit of what your new project is?
Yeah, absolutely. Finance and Coffee is a community for brokers. So not sort of just mortgage brokers, but people who are broking finance and this sort of thing, which was interesting for me from the point of view of I haven't ever done anything in fintech before, which is so you should always be looking at areas where you have no clue. It's always good fun. But also, pardon me, I like the idea of community building and I like the idea of trust-based communities where people are kind of actively engaging with each other to grow their own knowledge and help others grow knowledge. Myself and my partner in Finance and Coffee, Deanne, we were sort of looking at that industry and we realised that there wasn't really any of that kind of community in place for people to kind of share knowledge and share their understanding of kind of what worked and didn't work in that space. So we sort of went out there and sort of created a Facebook group and had a bit of a play with that and started looking at how we could sort of start to help people to answer questions around kind of how to engage with lenders and finance organisations and each other to a certain extent and ask the right questions. Over the last sort of 4 months or so, we've grown that from a fairly small group up to about 2,300 brokers, which is about sort of, I think we worked out the other day, is about a bit over 10% of the entire number of brokers in Australia, which is fairly good. Fairly happy with that. We've started to sort of get to the point now where we're about to open up a sort of forum for them and that sort of thing. And it's a way forward, I think, just to kind of really build this really nice community of people that are kind of trying to help each other.
Sure. So for anyone who would be sort of relevant to kind of join that community or is looking for something like that, what's the best way for them to find?
So Finance and Coffee is a group on Facebook, and that's probably the first place to go. If you get in there, just ask for a membership to the group. We are a little difficult as far as allowing people in at the moment. You have to actually be a broker to become part of the organisation, or if not, then you have to be providing sort of valuable information to brokers. From there, we are now about 2 weeks away from opening up the forum, and at the moment, financeandcoffee.com is a sort of a membership-based system. You actually have to be a member to be able to browse the current forum, and it's in sort of beta at the moment, but sort of the end of this month we'll be opening that up to the wider sort of community and letting people kind of access it. So
very exciting. I'll make sure that the link to the Facebook group and the website are in the show notes for anyone that's interested. I guess one of the two things that I'm kind of really sort of pulling away from this is, like, obviously looking at your sort of background, content has played a really big part in sort of all of the different roles that you sort of played. And I guess for startups, that can be something that they sort of look at but not really know how to start or how to engage. Can you, again, from your experience, can you kind of share, what are, why content may be important for startups to kind of share their stories or build communities or kind of add value, but also how startups can get sort of started in creating content and being sort of consistent with that process?
Absolutely. So I think you sort of touched on it a moment ago. I think storytelling for any startup is incredibly important. And where, take all the way back to the start of our discussion, if you're applying that to anything like partnerships or any of these kind of things, having a really interesting story to tell and getting people to actively engage with your story makes everything else you do so much easier. And I think a really interesting story, a really engaging story, just takes you to a new level as far as an organisation. It makes people want to actually be part of things. So content's incredibly important as far as kind of the way you put yourself forward, and I think in startup land, there's a lot of focus put on the pitch, and there's a lot of focus put on the kind of the deck and all those kind of and I think that's all cool. You need all those things, but you actually need an engaging story as well. You need a kind of why am I here? How did we get here? That kind of stuff is really interesting for people, I think. I think where you are sort of thinking about content and thinking about starting to create content, really the main piece of advice I normally give people in that kind of environment is just get started and do it. Really, you can't mess it up too much if you're kind of if you're being open, if you're being honest, if you're trying to actually tell your story. You can't make a hash of that, and so it's about getting it out there and then kind of looking for what people kind of enjoy, looking for what they like, looking for what they're interested in, and then doing more of that and starting to kind of amp it up as you go. If you understand your audience, you can hone that and you can come up with the things that are going to be really interesting to them. And if you've got a really nice story, then you can kind of build out your story over time and kind of start to tell different aspects to it and kind of different things that people are going to be interested in. I think content's a very underrated area for a lot of organisations, startups, but larger organisations as well. And I think if you have a really good understanding of your audience and you're giving them what they want content-wise, it can be a real growth engine for you, and it builds communities.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think content just plays a really important role. But one of the things that people sort of often overlook is that content can take many forms as well, depending on who your audience is. So, I mean, the podcast is a way for me to kind of deliver content. Doesn't just need to be written. It could be video. It could be sort of social content.
Yeah, there's amazing different and infographics and a whole lot of other things like that. So you're right. Like, I think there's so many different ways to kind of actively engage an audience that it's just about getting out there and just doing stuff and just finding out what works.
Absolutely. Yeah. Simon, thanks so much for your time today. For anyone that wants to get in touch, find out more, hear more about what you're up to and about Sitepoint, what's the best way for them to do that?
So they can email me. I'm fairly easy. It's simon@simonjulian.com. Easy to remember. Or they can contact me via LinkedIn or even Sitepoint. There's contacts there for me. So
perfect. Again,
always happy to chat.
Yeah, I'll make sure those links are in the show notes. Simon, once again, thanks so much for taking the time today to be on the show and for sharing your experience and insights.
No problem.
It's been fantastic.
Thank you.
It's
been great.
Thanks for listening to episode 46 of the Startup Playbook podcast. You can find the show notes of my interview with Simon, along with a curated list of tools and resources for startup founders at startupplaybook.co. As always, you can join the conversation through our Twitter account. The handle is @PlaybookStartup. Next week, I'll be interviewing Glenn Gillen. Glenn was an early hire at Heroku and is now back in Australia, spending most of his time as an active angel investor and helping to develop the Victorian startup community. In the episode, we chat about his experiences at Heroku, overcoming the challenges of scale, and what he looks for as an angel investor. Don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date with our latest episodes. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you at episode 47 next week.